Okay. Hello, everyone. I believe we are live. So hello and welcome to Breath of Life Alchemy. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jennifer Lynn Roseman, and I teach people just like you how to awaken your inner healer by merging ancient healing practices with cutting edge science in order to reclaim control over your health and well-being. So today's class that was voted on by the group is all about untriggering ourselves when we are feeling triggered. So, the good news is that this falls in alignment with everything we've already been talking about in regards to nervous system resiliency, in regards to somatic experiencing and somatic awareness techniques. But what I think you'll be pleased with is that it might be delivered in a way that might land for you a little bit better. And right, like each situation that we're in, we're like, okay, I can apply this here and I can apply this there. So the triggering is a really big one. And as I always welcome you all to do, is if at any point you feel triggered by this lecture about triggering, you pause and take a break and then come back, knowing that the video is always posted in the group. So I would like to take a moment to arrive here together in this virtual space. So if you have the time and place to join me in a grounding and orienting practice, let's do that. So you can keep your eyes opened or closed for this process. And I invite you to just land where you are. And sometimes I imagine my energy is like a plane or a bird, and I'm like flying around, going about my day. And then I am attempting to land right here in the present moment to be as fully here and now as I can be. And so this is where the technique of grounding comes in very handy. So you can do this with me again if you have space and time to just take a moment and feel whatever parts of your body are either touching the ground or the support beneath you. So for me, I'm sitting with my legs crossed in the chair. So I'm feeling my legs in the chair, my seat in the chair. And I'm really feeling my back body today resting against the chair. And it feels so good and supporting. So I'm just going to lean into that part that feels really good to me and see if I can expand that a little bit more. And now I'm just scanning my body. So I invite you to do that for yourself from head to toe, just checking in with how your body's physically feeling without trying to change it or even judge it, just noticing the body with the sense of curiosity and exploration. And so for me, when I do that, I notice my hands more fully on my lap. And for whatever reason, that was even more grounding for me. And I could tell because I was able to take a deep breath in and out. So you might be able to look for those signs of energetic settling in yourself as well. And if you are feeling complete with your grounding as I am, I'm going to open my eyes and start to orient to the room around me. So I'm just going to look around and just notice what I see. I have this really beautiful picture of my little kitty that died recently, Milo. So I'm looking at that and smiling at his face. I have a nice candle burning that smells like lavender. So I'm taking in the scent, right? So all of the senses are being engaged here. And I'm noticing the noise of the fan that's behind me going, the slight hum. So I'm just landing here with that. Okay. So hopefully you have arrived back in this space with me. Welcome, welcome. And today's lesson was really great for me to plan. You know, teaching these things, it's really funny how it triggers, word of the day, all of the material to come up. So it's like, you got to embody it, right? So for me, what I've noticed over the past few days is that I was super triggered, super triggered. And I was like, thank you, universe. How perfect to allow me to really land into what I'm teaching and practice these things. So I'm going to give a little summary at the beginning about what our goal is. So the goal for any trigger overall is what I have been taught to call and just love are the 5 T's. So the 5 T's are trust, the, trigger, to, teach. Okay, so if we know that when we're triggered, we can look at it as an opportunity to teach us something about ourselves, then it doesn't become as heavy and it doesn't become as triggering. So there is a 4-step, very practical process to state shifting when we're triggered. And so step 1, which is often the most difficult, is to recognize it and then to name it, right? So we're just noticing that we are triggered here, which again, the hardest step out of the whole process. And we'll get into why. The second step is to take a time out to assess and pause in order to avoid doing or saying something that we may regret later on. Step 3 is to shift our state. And we do this by employing techniques to regulate the nervous system and discharge the sensations in the body. And then step 4 is to repair. And that means to deal with the situation both externally and internally. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So those are the 4 steps. And I want to kind of just really briefly mention this, that there are what I view as 2 different types of triggers, right? So there's an external trigger that's stimulated by an external stimuli, and then there's an internal trigger. And what I think internal triggers are for myself, and I noticed this because it came up for me so much in the past few days, is that when you have chronic illness or pain, those things are internal triggers, right? Like they're a low grade triggering of our nervous system all the time, which can make us have a higher tendency to be more triggered from external circumstances. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense for you all. And I also, well, we'll get into that later. Okay, so I want to go into the 2 different types of triggers that we can talk about. So one stems from post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a single traumatic event. And these types of triggers can be set off by something in our environment. And it can be a sound, a smell, a sight, a taste, a touch, or a similar experience of the traumatic event. And this can trigger a literal flashback, like we can actually see it and that we're fully involved in the event, or just the feeling of it. And again, it's like to the extent that we're actually reliving it. And then there are triggers that are caused from complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I want to just say this, that like the DSM, which is the manual with which they diagnose psychological disorders, complex PTSD is not yet in there. Shame, shame, but it should be soon. But it is really important. So complex PTSD typically is involved with developmental trauma, something that happened between when we were in utero, in our mama's bellies, and between the ages of 18, really. So before we were born to the age of 18, especially within the first 8 years of life. And it's something that's typically was an event that was repeated over time, right? So typically complex PTSD arises from our family units, our culture, some other things. I went into that a lot last week. So if you want to check out last week's video, you can do that. But these types of triggers are activated by other people's behaviors and or our subconscious expectations not being met. So this involves experiences from our childhood where we felt unsafe, let down, unloved, and disconnected. So I'm going to give an example, a personal example for me, even though I've already given a few. So when I was 23 or 24-ish, I lived in Center City, Philadelphia, and I was walking to work. And I was crossing the street, this like 3-lane giant road, and I was hit by a car as a pedestrian. And I rolled up onto the hood of the van. He slammed on his brake. I flew forward into the street, landed on my ankle, got a severe sprain from that. Rolled down the street a little more. Cars were still going in both lanes besides me. Thought I was going to die. So I was officially diagnosed with post-traumatic stress after that accident. How did I know that I needed to do that? So after getting hit by the car, the first time I went out for a walk in my neighborhood, because in Philadelphia, you don't have a car, you walk everywhere because it's easier. If you've ever lived in a major city, or if you do, you might know this. And you have to just walk everywhere, cross lots of streets. And the first time I crossed the street, I flipped out. I was with my boyfriend at the time, luckily, but as soon as we got to the other side of the street, I collapsed into a ball. I was crying and shaking, and I thought that people were going to kill me. There was no one around outside of my boyfriend, but I thought people were going to kill me. He managed to get me back into the apartment that we were living in, and I was like, oh my God, something is really wrong. My brain broke. So I went to trauma therapy for that. And we walked through a lot of somatic type work, centering and grounding work. So I got to the point where I was able to walk across the street. But my body physically stored that trauma. And because I injured my left ankle, so it was like hyperflexed in this direction, it was maybe 15 years later when I was in a massage therapy class and someone moved my ankle in that same direction, and my whole nervous system was triggered into a activated response. I started sweating, my heart started racing, I started crying. Okay, so that's an example of PTSD type triggers. Another trigger that happened for me was when I was in the somatic training that I was a part of, and my teacher did a live demo on another student in the class who had just recently been in a severe car accident where she was injured. And even the student telling her story was very activating for me. And I actually dissociated for about like 24 hours. So again, another way that like the post-traumatic stress disorder from a single event can impact us. So I want to mention this as a side note. So the root of the post-traumatic stress disorder for me, as the literature and studies are showing more and more of, that it happened because there is this core wound from my childhood about not being seen and learning that there is something inherently wrong with me that doesn't deserve to be seen. And therefore, my conclusion is that I am unlovable and alone, which is obviously the worst thing for a helpless small baby or child to feel, right? And so they've done a lot of studies psychologically where if a baby is left alone and unnurtured by a caregiver, they will die, right? So like the worst things that are still being held in our nervous system is to feel unloved and alone, right? There's still this deep yearning and desire for those things, even if we can't admit that. And so when this event occurred with the van hitting me and I got PTSD, there's this recognition and acknowledgement that we have to have that that might not have happened to someone else that had a similar core wound as me. Because there are countless examples of two people experiencing the exact same event, and some people develop PTSD and some do not. The same thing with emotional triggers, right? Which is why one experience can be emotionally triggering for one person and not to the other. So this complex PTSD example is, again, like, I don't know if you see it, but as I saw the van coming towards me, things seemed to slow down. And there was this voice inside my head that yelled repeatedly at the van just before it hit me, "Why don't you see me?" So you can maybe see that my subconscious was like screaming to be seen, and the van still didn't hit me. I mean, still didn't see me and hit me, which created this like stacking on top of the trigger, right? So like these things stacked on top of each other, and my brain just freaked out. So the complex PTSD example of this is that currently shows up for me is when I feel that I am being disrespected. And my subconscious program is that this person who I am viewing as a threat, right, doesn't respect or see who I am, and that I have an inherent worth as a human being. And therefore, I will get angry so that they will see me. So my nervous system will go into a fight pattern, a fight response, in order to attempt to get my needs met. So when I am disrespected, I assume and I tell myself, often subconsciously, this story that is based on my experience from the past that is coloring my ability to see clearly and respond to the current situation appropriately. So in the previous example, I need to gain awareness that me being triggered stems from this feeling of not being seen, which then leads to I don't deserve to be loved, which leads to I am alone, disconnected, and life is not worth living. Right? So you can get this idea of like a part of untriggering ourselves is to learn our own story behind our triggers themselves. So going over a little bit more about trauma. Trauma is a time distortion disorder. So the trigger, whatever it is, brings up a memory or memories from the past, and our nervous system responds in a fight, flight, or freeze pattern, which shuts down our neocortex, the front, most newly developed and evolved part of our brain, and triggers the limbic system, which is the midbrain, and the amygdala, which lives in the limbic system, to activate in such a way that we aren't just reacting to the event or situation in front of us at the present moment, but it triggers all of the subconscious traumatic events of the past to come flooding in. So this takes the adult or present day version of ourselves totally offline, and this animalistic and often childlike aspect of the self takes over. Okay, so like the prefrontal cortex shuts down, our nervous system takes over because it's recognizing a huge threat, and it makes us feel really raw and really vulnerable, even if we're not conscious of it. So our physiology responds in this activated way of our nervous system, right? So some of the symptoms, our heart races, we sweat, our muscles contract, or for freeze response, we can go numb and speechless. Emotionally, the primary emotions of fear, anger, sadness, or disgust arise. And as I was planning this lecture, I realized how interesting that the primary emotions, which when I went over last week, you all learned if you were able to watch that they are a part of our nervous system response. So we can't control whether or not we feel them in the moment, right? When we're triggered by an external circumstance. And joy is the fifth one, right? So it's like, no wonder our nervous systems are wired to perceive triggers sometimes when they're not even there, or really like blow the trigger out of proportion, because joy is just one out of the five, right? So we got five other things that are pretty intense. And we love joy, right? Sometimes we just love to live in joy, but that's not reality. So because our neocortex, which again is the most evolved part of the brain that separates us from the animal kingdom, goes offline, we temporarily lose the ability to respond to this situation, and we animalistically react to the situation instead. So the idea here is not to get to a place where we are never triggered, but to learn how to recognize when we are triggered more quickly, apply skills and techniques, which we will learn in this class, to bring our neofrontal cortex back online and respond appropriately to the situation in front of us. So we can learn our personal signs and symptoms of being triggered. And we need to know that it will be different for everyone. And like I said, the hardest part of this whole process is recognizing that we are triggered in the first place. So how do we know? So here are some common signs. The first one is physical sensations, right? This is where somatic awareness can really come into play. And it's important to know that our minds lie all the time, right? Lie to other people, lie to ourselves. This happens especially when we are triggered. We should not trust any of our thoughts. Our bodies, however, tell the truth. So an example is, let's say Robert is having trouble recognizing that he is angry. And his wife would say something like, "I think you're angry." And he would protest, "No, I'm not." And then his wife would say, "Just look at your hands." And Robert's fist would be like this, right? So his body, right? This is the posture channel in somatic awareness, somatic experiencing, was expressing the fight response, and his mind was trying to convince him that he wasn't feeling it. So there are often very clear physical sensations that will tell us we're triggered. So other signs, our stomachs or our jaws can clench, we'll feel hot, our eyes begin to water, we can stop breathing, or we can start hyperventilating. And so by noticing these body sensations, we may be able to identify, I'm triggered. Sign number 2, judging thoughts. So for many of us, the first place our minds go when we're triggered is to start blaming the other person or situation. We get really defensive here. All our years of education and life experience go into finding fault with the person or thing that triggered us. This might be someone who we love or respect in everyday normal reality, but when we're triggered, they're the enemy. Third sign, you have difficulty paying attention, you experience dissociation, exhaustion, and sometimes even have escape fantasies. So for those of us that tend more towards a freeze response, and some of us are just naturally more freezy, based again on developmental trauma, our signs of being triggered might be spacing out, suddenly feeling drained or exhausted, dissociated, and difficult, having trouble thinking or recalling things. So these reactions are really typical in those of us who tend towards a freeze state, like I said. So all of a sudden we can lose our energy as if the life has been drained out of us and we can't think straight. So these are telltale signs. And this is when you know you've been taken over by the nervous system response of freeze and you are triggered. Sign number 4, defensiveness. You find yourself pleading your case, justifying yourself, marshaling your argument and counter arguments. This may be out loud to a person that triggered you or venting to a third party. A sure sign that you're triggered is when it's hours after the triggering event, you're all alone and you're still going at it in your mind. You're complaining how you were wronged or why it's not your fault, as if there were some imaginary judge in the sky listening to your rant. I just love that, right? And the imaginary person would be like, "Good point. You're totally right." Keep just circling through this vicious cycle. It's very helpful. It's not helpful. Sign number 5, obsessively repeating thought patterns. And this is like kind of like the defensiveness cycle, right? That we can get into, just complaining over and over in our heads about the situation. And it reminds me of just like a hamster on a wheel, right? You're not going anywhere. You're just running around in circles. And it's the same thing that can happen with our mind. We replay the same event and situation over and over again, sometimes to the point of total exhaustion, because it is exhausting, because we're literally just running our whole immune system and our physical body just on overdrive, and it's just not sustainable. So sign number 6, emotional outbursts. So when we're triggered, sometimes we just totally lose it. Our emotional hijacking leads right into inappropriate outbursts of feeling. There are many times when it's completely appropriate to share what we feel, but the telltale sign of triggering is when feeling comes bursting forth without conscious thought in ways that we are likely to regret later. So for a lot of us, this can be anger. This can be all of a sudden we start crying. It can be a fear response. It can be disgust. Again, any of the primary emotions, we just don't typically consider joy within there because we like joy. Sign number 7, the last sign, sudden intensive engagement in addictive behaviors. So this is where the triggering event causes us to engage in whatever our addictive behavior of choice is. So that could be eating or overeating, I should say. It could be surfing the web or scrolling your phone. It could be retail therapy. It could be going for that cigarette or alcohol or drug of choice, right? So if we have an addiction, a lot of us use those things to try and help us calm down when we're triggered. So question for you all that are live, do any of these resonate? What happens when you're triggered? And do you have any unique telltale signs? And if you do, you can just write them in the chat in the comments so we can all get to know what our own personal responses are. Mine are definitely physical sensations, judging thoughts. I can honestly, I can display all 7 of these depending on what the trigger is. Um, Typically, if it's a stronger trigger for me, I will definitely go more into freeze response and the dissociative behaviors for sure. So what I would love to do now is take a little break from the lecture part and do a somatic practice to help us identify our personal trigger response. So sometimes, lists like this will resonate. Yeah, Carol, you get hot and angry. Yes. Yeah, so that's like typically the fight pattern. Moves up the body, gets angry, tension in the neck, jaw, upper body. Okay, so let's move into a somatic practice. So again, this is only if you have the space and time to do this. This is going to be more of a quick one. So I invite you again to just make contact with whatever you're sitting on. And if it's comfortable for you to close your eyes, again, some of us feel and sense better when our eyes are closed. I invite you to do that. And what I would like you to do is bring into your awareness something that you find triggering. And if you can't think of anything, typically politics or religion can be triggering for people. So you can think about that. You can think about an argument you recently had with someone. It could be anything. It could be like the stereo didn't work and you freaked out because your stereo didn't work. Whatever it is. So just bring that to your mind, into your awareness. And as you do that, notice what happens in your body. And again, for each of us, it will be different. But what is the sensation that your body feels? So for me, when I think of a trigger, I feel like this drop, like there's this very deep drop from my heart into the pit of my stomach. And then my stomach contracts. So that's the sensation that I'm noticing. And the feeling with that is like there's this like vacancy, this like a vacant space. So just first dive into the sensation of that. What does it feel like in your body? and walk through all of the channels here. And then if there was an image that you could associate with this sensation, what would that image be? And a reminder, some of us have a very hard time with the imagination channel. So if you don't see an image, that's fine. But if you do, what does that look like? So for me, in my mind's eye, I'm seeing a brick wall with this like vacant space around it. And we're not trying to do anything with these sensations or images, right? We're just allowing them to be there to just play with what our natural responses to triggers can be. So now we're going to go into the posture channel. And is there a physical movement that your body wants to make when you think about this triggering thing? So for some of us, like I mentioned before, our fists can want to clench, or our jaws might want to clench. We might find our shoulders wanting to lift up towards our ears, or we might feel like we want to contract into a ball, right? Contract inwards. So I invite you to just play with the posture channel. And if you're feeling the body wanting to go into a movement, just allow that to happen. But do it really slowly. So if you want to make fists, just open and close your fists really slowly. If your shoulders want to move up to your ears, just do that movement really slowly up and down. Or if your jaw wants to clench, just kind of like slowly chew, right? Move in the direction of the jaw clenching. So as you do that, oftentimes we can notice purges of energy. So you might get hot, you might get sweaty, you might yawn, your eyes might start tearing, something else might start showing up in the system. So just allow whatever to happen to arise. And now we're going to go into the emotion channel. So what emotion comes up when you think of the triggering event? And this might have already happened, right? Sometimes this happens first. We think of an event, we're like, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm sad, I'm fearful, whatever it is. If you're feeling a secondary emotion, so secondary emotions are more like guilt, shame. Those secondary emotions are secondary, right? And so there's typically a primary emotion that lives underneath that. So if you're feeling guilt or shame, I'm going to ask you to like maybe push it aside a little bit. Not that you're ignoring it, you're just peeking behind the curtain and see what primary emotion is behind that curtain. And so for me, what I'm noticing is where I thought it was anger, it's actually sadness. Sadness is actually like the root. It's almost like I'm visualizing it here, the energy, like the sadness is the root and the anger was like a blanket on top of the sadness. So we're just like lifting layers of awareness here, like we're peeling an onion, right? And so as I allow myself to feel that sadness, my eyes start to tear. You might notice something else. Again, some energetic purging might happen. You might start to actively cry. Or if you're tapping into anger, you might really want to actively scream. So I invite you to do that if you feel like that would be really helpful for you. You can either scream out loud, or sometimes I'll just imagine myself like primal screaming, like just really like getting into it, but in my mind. So it's silent, but it's like I'm getting into the whole physiology of like what that scream would feel like in my body. Okay. So wherever you are in this process, I invite you to reconnect with the breath. Again, this is just going to be a really quick one just to see and play what shows up for us. So reconnect with the breath, reground, feel the body in the chair. And if you haven't already done so, open your eyes and orient to the room. Again, just find something pleasant that you can see around you and come back. So if you're able to do that with me, I highly invite you to type in the comments what you notice if you feel comfortable. Either if you're here live or on the recording, I would love to hear if you're watching the replay. And so again, this is a part of that like physical somatic intelligence that we can start to develop within our own selves, that we can just recognize when we're being triggered, right? Our bodies will tend to have the same or very similar physiological responses to triggers. And we'll get better and better at recognizing this, right? So our first job in this whole process is to, number one, notice that I am triggered and then name it by saying it out loud or in my head, I am triggered. Okay. Really simple, but very complex at the same time, right? Something that we have to learn how to recognize better and better. Yeah, Carol, feel hot, jaw tightened, and then crying under it all. Yeah. Yeah, that sadness is a good one, right? So much that we can cry about. So the second step is to pause and give ourselves a timeout, right? So some people, one of my teachers, Atira Tan, referred to this as the sacred pause, right? So once we recognize that we're triggered, our job is to be like, hold up, timeout. And again, this is always to avoid doing or saying something from a reactive state that we may regret later. Because we know, right? So if you're taking this class, that our prefrontal cortex, our neocortex is offline, we literally don't have the ability to think clearly about the situation that's triggering us. So pausing not only prevents us from doing something that we might say or regret later, but it also gives us time to explore our own physiological sensations that are occurring in the body, right? So basically what we just did, the somatic practice. What I like to do after that, the third step for me, and again, everyone will have their preference and there are other things I'll list later, but what I like to do is say the Ho'oponopono prayer. And I'll tell you what that is. So I'm going to say this to the other person or people that are triggering me, and I'm going to say it to myself. And the Ho'oponopono prayer goes like this: I am sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. Right. And so this is why we need to check in somatically, feel our feelings first, and then say this prayer or this mantra. And you might first think, why would I say this to the other person that's triggering me, right? Especially if it was like an official attack in some way. And it's because we're forgiving the other person, not for them, but for ourselves. So basically, we're refusing to store their sad, traumatic energy in our own bodies. And so we're forgiving them. We're saying that we're sorry because we're all mirrors for each other, right? So there's something about me that activated something in them, potentially, right? That could have triggered this whole response, right? It's not my fault, but I'm recognizing that we live in this dynamic, participatory, co-creative world. And so when I say, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, I love you, yes, I'm saying it to them, but I'm saying it to myself for my own role and to my own inner child wounding, right? So this goes back to the developmental complex PTSD thing, where when we apologize to those inner child parts of ourselves, to those wounded parts of ourselves, when we thank it, when we tell them that we love them, it creates a healing response in our body. And our nervous system naturally, calm down, right? Because we're receiving love and connection, the two things that our primal nervous system and our inner childs want the most in this world. Okay. So that's the third thing that I do. And what I'll do is I'll repeat this prayer in my mind until I really actually start to feel the words that I'm saying. Because at first we can still be so triggered and our nervous system can be so activated that we're just like repeating the words like, I'm sorry, please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. Right. I said, I roll my eyes. I'm a big eye roller. That's another sign that I'm triggered. I forgot about that one. Um, so I'll say that and I'll repeat it and I'll repeat it and I'll repeat it until I start to actually feel like the words are true in my body. So this can take a little bit of time. But again, we're giving ourselves the time and space to do this, right? And sometimes we're in these situations with other people or a person where we literally have to ask for this, right? Like, I just need some time and space to take a breath from this for a moment. I'm just going to step away. I will be back when I feel a little bit more calmer and I can integrate the situation with you. If you don't feel like you can say that, the bathroom is a really good excuse. Say you have to go to the bathroom, right? Anything. Okay. So yeah, so this is a really good technique that I use to help regulate my nervous system and turn my neocortex back on. So the other thing that I really need to know in a triggering situation is that everyone involved in the situation is truly perceiving the situation in itself differently. And again, this is why we need to offer love and forgiveness to both the other person slash people and also to myself, because we all have our own version of reality. It's like we're all wearing these sunglasses that are coloring all of our experiences. And like I said before, in doing this, this creates this micro inner child healing on the spot that helps the nervous system relax and creates this feeling, knowledge, gnosis, that we are loved and have a space in this world, right? So two really important things. And from this more regulated state, I can then ask myself, how are my past traumas and wounding showing up in this moment, creating the triggered nervous system response that I am experiencing? And then I can repair that. Okay. There's a lot of steps, but we got through all four. So there's a little bit more details to come. So I want to get into a little bit more about how everyone sees reality based on their own personal history, because it's really important to have that gnosis and awareness when you're dealing with triggers. So because our nervous systems are more animalistic in terms of our response, and our responses are based on our personal history, meaning that our limbic brain that houses the amygdala is trained to create a fear response based on our personal threat history, i.e., trauma. So we can never be 100% sure as to why someone is behaving the way they are, let alone ourselves, right? It's hard enough to know ourselves. It is even harder to know another person, like truly from the inside out, which I just rewatched that movie. It's a great movie about emotions. If you haven't watched it, give it a watch. So when triggered, my immediate assumption is that it is a malicious attack, right? So I perceive it as a purposeful, malicious attack. But I really can't truly know that, right? And even if it is an attack, the person is purposely trying to hurt or harm me in some way. especially emotionally, right? Which is more of what we're dealing with here. If it's a physical attack, we get the hell out of there, right? Or we fight back. But they're really doing that because of their own traumas. So instead of having two people in this constant trauma response, just continuing to trigger and react to each other, we can opt out and escape the matrix, so to speak, by practicing regulating the nervous system, turning the neocortex back on so that we can properly assess the situation and gain insight into where we are coming from, what core wounds are being triggered, and assess what we need in order to heal them. And from this neutral space of reason, then we can respond to the situation instead of automatically react. Right? So hopefully that makes sense to you all. So again, going over the 4 steps to state shift when triggered are: 1, recognize we are triggered and name it. 2, pausing or taking a time out to notice the sensations in our body and the emotions we are experiencing. So the skill here is grounding and orienting, which I always have us do in every live, and the somatic awareness practice. Okay. And then we can ask ourselves also a question during this pause: am I perceiving the situation 100% correctly? Could there be another reason the person or situation came about that I haven't yet considered? And then 3, we ask ourselves what we need in this moment to feel safe and or move the energy in our systems. So these are techniques like just expressing the emotion, movement, moving the body, right? You can sometimes put on a song. If you're feeling angry, put on an angry song and like dance it out. If you're feeling sad, put on a sad song, etc. We can self-soothe. So for some of that looks like taking a bubble bath, having a warm cup of tea, doing the havening technique, which is where we kind of just squeeze our shoulders and give ourselves a hug. We may need to ground and orient more. We can also try naming the personal story that we are approaching the situation with. Sometimes this will lead to engaging with self-humor, right? We can just be like, oh, I'm running that program again because I'm triggered, right? We can change our physical location, right? So this is activating the flight response. We go from one location where the triggering event occurred to another location. We can reconnect with our breath, or we can use mantras. Again, like my favorite one for this triggering situation is the Ho'oponopono prayer. I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, I love you. And then the 4th part is the repair, which is where we address the situation both externally and internally. So this is where we take the time to ask ourselves important questions. And so you can ask yourself questions, and you can record yourself on a tape recorder, or if you're a journaler, you can journal it. However you feel best to do this is fine. So some of the questions we can ask ourselves is, what story was I telling myself based on my personal history that was coloring my ability to see the situation clearly? Was my perception of reality 100% true or correct? And then a follow-up question is, what about this person's behavior is a mirror of something that I don't want to look at in myself, right? So let's say the person lied to you. The question then becomes, how do I lie to myself? Or how do I lie to other people, right? So that's more of some shadow work. Another question is, when have I felt this way before? What was the first event? And what did I learn, or what core wound belief arose out of this event, right? So like the example I gave at the beginning, walking through, not being seen, my core wound, right? The core thought, which is so true for most of us, what we're the most deeply afraid of, but have trouble admitting, is that there's this belief that we are not lovable and that we'll end up alone and that life isn't worth living. And the last question I have here is, what do I need to do to repair this, truly repair it? And so ways we can do this, and I have done this in some past lives, I'm not going to do it here again because we've already been going for a while, is where we can actually re-envision the past to create new neural circuitry so that we are triggered less often and we are able to recognize and repair more quickly. So meaning we build resiliency and a greater capacity to hold both the beauty and the horror of this world that we live in, which both exist simultaneously. So when we re-envision the past, what we can do, again, this is like when you're recognizing, okay, I'm triggered by this thing because it reminds me of this thing that happened when I was very little. So for me, what I envision and have actively envisioned is I am a small baby. I am a sick baby, totally overwhelming my parents. And they have me in this swing on the table, right? So they're using this swing to swing me to help regulate my nervous system instead of them picking me up and holding me, right? Because really, you can't do that 24/7. And my system probably actually needed that, but it's an impossible thing to do for a parent. So what I envision is the adult version of me, or if it's you, let's say it can be an imaginary character. It can be a magical unicorn. It can be a motherly bear. It can be Wonder Woman. It could be whatever. I imagine for me in this vision, my current self picking up my little baby me and holding me and rubbing her back. And just allowing her to be, like meeting her with full acceptance, full nurturing, full comfort that she deserves and was so desperate for when she was younger, but didn't get. And so as you do this, right, this is like, I did that for 5 seconds, I'm already crying. Okay. So like it helps to repair us neurologically in ways that have amazing transformational effects far beyond what we can mentally even conceive of. So that was kind of the crust of this whole lecture. How are you all doing? I love your feedback. Again, if you're watching this live, great. If you're watching this in the replay, let me know how you're doing. So I want to just conclude, right? So the main purpose of this lecture is to trust the trigger to teach. And metaphysically, because the universe is holographic in nature, right? And if you are into quantum physics, like I am, Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, right? Where they can separate two electrons at a far distance, and a scientist spins one on one end, and on the other end, the same one spins at the same time in the same direction, right? So spooky at a distance, meaning that technically we are all a part of the same system and we all mirror each other. And we all reflect our own perceptions of reality. So we can see this in nature and we can see this in ourselves in regards to Chinese medicine and other types of body work. The body is actually viewed as holographic. So you can treat the whole system in Chinese medicine, let's say, just from the ear. Or we can see physically that our hands are a mirror of our feet. Here's my foot. Or our shoulders are a mirror for our hips. And our arm bones are actually mirrors of our leg bones, etc. So our relationships, which create our experiences in the world, which in turn create our triggers, are the vehicles that we can use to begin to see and gain insight into our own key wounds and subconscious beliefs about the world and our place in it. So if we are originally wounded through our experiences in relationships, it is through relationships that we can truly heal this. And again, like when I think of this, it's not just through external relationships, right? But it's the relationship that we have with our own selves. So the more that we're able to know ourselves, the more we are able to gain the insight we need to heal and live in a more neutral reality, meaning our window of tolerance for both the good and the bad that we experience in the world will widen because we're able to hold a perspective that is able to see a wider picture, right? A more neutral, more comprehensive picture. And when we can see ourselves in the other person that is triggering us and see the other person in ourselves, we are able to move into a more neutral perspective. And when we are in a more neutral perspective, we are able to see both sides of the polarity that always exists simultaneously in the world. I personally call it the beauty and the horror. And from this space, we can understand with the compassion the why and the how of the occurrences and what role we can adopt in order to respond appropriately to gain any get to any situation that comes our way. Right. So that's the whole point. So I hope you enjoyed this practice and this little lecture. I loved doing this because this is honestly really helpful for me. And this is something that actually I'll probably rewatch and have it as a tool when I'm triggered. Because again, when we're triggered, we just go offline. We can't remember anything. Be like, what did she tell me to do? What do I need to do? Where am I? Right? Like we lose space and time completely. We lose our ground. Um, so yeah, so let me know how you felt about this lecture. I also am going to post in the comments a YouTube video that Ram Dass did. Well, technically he didn't do the video, but it's an excerpt from one of his talks about how to keep your heart open in hell, which I feel like is very relevant here in terms of what we talked about. So I look forward to that. And thank you so much for joining. I hope to see you in the near future next week. And I will eventually most likely be posting another poll about what you want me to talk about next week. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.